Thank you very much to everybody who's joining us from all around the world, actually. It's great to have a global audience, and it's really important that we come together for this conversation. So my name is Anna Marie Phelps. I'm the co-chair of the Global Executive of the International Working Group on Women in Sport. And we're hosting this, what we're calling a shift session. It's the second, and it's about leadership, so leading the shift. We're going to be talking to Professor Laura McAllister, CBE, fantastic leader, and I'll introduce her in just a minute, about four main themes, I guess. So starting off with what are the real levers for change? We're going to explore leading with purpose, breaking barriers and transforming the system, and opening the door and holding it open. What is the legacy of what we want to do? So I'm really keen, really fantastic to see so many of you here. We would love you to share your questions in the Q&A. So there are two buttons at the bottom, one for questions, which we'll be monitoring throughout this hour, and a second one for chat. And so if you just have comments to make, please introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what the organisation is, whereabouts in the world you are. We'd love to know who it is that's listening in today. So please do use the chat button for that and the Q&A if you'd like to ask us questions. And I'll leave some space at the end, but I'm really keen to integrate those questions throughout this session if something comes up that's really relevant. Finally, I just need to remind everybody that we are recording the session so that we can put it onto YouTube later, so you'll be able to look back on that afterwards when that's all been done. So it gives me huge pleasure to introduce Professor Laura McAllister, CBE, former Wales football captain, Professor of Public Policy and Governance at Cardiff University, UEFA Vice President, and an advocate for equity and inclusive leadership throughout her life. Laura, welcome. You've gone through so many parts of your journey, from activists to politics to academics, and now really as a sport leader. I would see that as a journey. You'll probably tell me you've been doing them all along. Throughout that journey, how have you seen leadership behaviours and culture change in sport?
Well, first and foremost, Anna Marie, Prynhawn Da from Wales, from Cymru. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much indeed for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak to an international audience about a subject that's very close to my heart. I feel I live this concept on a daily basis now in the work that I'm doing with UEFA in European football. And you're right, I would challenge the kind of compartmentalization of the roles that I've had through my career, because I still feel that first and foremost, I'm a sports enthusiast and a sports person. I mean, obviously, as one gets older, the ability to do quite what we did when we were much younger diminishes. But, you know, I still play vets football, and I still play squash, and I still run, and I still go and see my beloved Cardiff City and Wales women and Wales men. So I see myself first and foremost as somebody who's immersed in that sporting space, but now someone who has the fortune to be involved in decision making as well. And I think, you know, the roles that you touched upon as an activist, as somebody who's been involved in the power and political space, and now as a leader, all intertwine, because I think it was my frustration at the lack of female voices in the upper tiers of sports governance, whilst I was a player myself, that gave me the impetus to get involved when I retired from playing football. So I don't really see a separation between those. I think I'm still an activist in that I still get incredibly frustrated and angry at things that happen in the world of sports governance. I've always been politically inclined, and I use that term in the broader sense because from a very young age, I've been aware that all decisions are based on power, and all relationships are based on the distribution of power between people within organizations. So the political part of the work I do now comes quite naturally to me. So I still see myself as somebody in that space. But I guess the real change for me was the election to UEFA's ExCo, the executive committee or board of the organisation. The day of the election back in 2023, so 2 years ago, I was made vice president on that day. So I immediately went into a space where I had a designated role. And I think we'll talk a lot more about this, obviously, in the discussion we have. But I think that was very much a Rubicon, if you like. It was significant change in how I had to conduct my leadership and how I had to behave and how I had to tactically operate in order to get the most benefit I could for women in football.
And do you think you had to change the way you behaved in that space, or was it a sort of natural growth? Because you'd done so much before it that you could
Yes.
just say achieving that, being the first female vice president of UEFA, that could have been it. Yeah, you'd been there. That could be your best achievement, but you haven't, have you?
Well, no, and I mean, there's two things I'd say about that. I mean, first and foremost, I never really see an end point to a journey because I think the context changes around us. So if one believes that one has made it, so to speak, and is in a leadership role and therefore put your feet up and take the benefits, then we're not doing any justice to the importance of those leadership roles. So there's that. Then the second part is that we're continually learning. I've never felt that I know it all, and I'm a long way from knowing as much as I need to know now to be able to operate in this role successfully. So whilst I've had roles before in UK sport and I chaired Sport Wales for 2 terms, and I've been involved with the Football Association of Wales and so on, this is easily the most radical shift in my leadership context. And you asked the question, Anna Marie, about thinking about how I behave. I've done more thinking about how I behave in this role than in the rest of my career combined. And there's an obvious reason for this, which is that when I was elected in 2023, I was the only woman on the board. Crazy as that seems, I'm sure, to lots of your participants this afternoon. Or maybe it doesn't, maybe in some other countries across the world, that's normal. But for me, it wasn't normal. I was used to a much more gender balanced environment to work in sports decision making. But I also knew what I was going into. I knew that the discussions around women's representation and indeed about women's voices when it came to football would be difficult at times. And so to answer your question, I've had to think very, very carefully and constantly about how I behave because I'm very conscious that there is no point whatsoever me being in this senior position unless I can persuade others around me to come on the journey for change and to make sure that UEFA and other football organisations are much more gender balanced in the future.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, it's fascinating. I think we both agree that we are far from having enough women leaders in sport so far. When do you think, beyond simply having more women at the table, what would success look like for leadership in this space? What do you see as the difference that you can bring? I mean, I don't want to specifically talk about UEFA specifically, but by
Yes.
putting women around those tables, generally, what is the difference that we can bring to sport and to the decision making?
I like the idea of integrating the debate about representation into efficacy and efficiency because I'm sure, like lots of people, and I'm sure as you've experienced, Anna Marie, a lot of sports boards and sports organisations aren't terribly efficiently run, certainly not to maximum effect. And a part of that comes from a lack of diversity. So I like the idea of building a business case around representational diversity, but sometimes we get sucked into the debate then of assuming that if we get a representative board with decent numbers of women and decent numbers of people who are people of colour, for example, or people who are disabled or younger people or whatever the characteristics are, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, there are connections between those characteristics. I think we failed to emphasize one important component, which is that if you have a diverse board, you have experiential diversity, people who have representational characteristics will have come from different types of backgrounds, will have had different experiences as children, and so on and so forth. And that's what you bring to a more diverse board. But I don't think historically we've been strong enough in making that business case. It's easy to talk in contrast. So you can say, look, here's a diverse board, look how well it performs. But then a board that's made up entirely of men, for example, or white men in a European context, would claim that the experience they bring is relevant and valid. And there's no doubt that's the case, but what it isn't is different. You will have lots of similar conversations, you'll have lots of reinforced views, you'll have lots of kind of often myopic understandings of how sport is run and what the appeal could be to a broader audience. So I think the experiential diversity point is something we need to really emphasize more strongly. And like everything, when it comes to the distribution of power, I think we've got to put some effort into a different narrative about how we communicate these things. There's in every epoch, there's a backlash to where you've got to, and who knows? I mean, bearing in mind global affairs, where are we now entering an epoch where all principles of equality and diversity and inclusion are being challenged almost existentially? And so for me, it's about trying to circumvent that, because we might not be able to change the global context, by talking about things like experiential diversity on boards and how that can actually refine and modernize the governance of sport. And I think that could be a big win for us.
Yeah, there's a lot of redefining, I think, of things at the moment, given what's going on globally, isn't there? Using words like belonging and experience and things like that that are used. I mean, in terms of the opportunities you've had, Laura, can you share a moment where you successfully shifted a decision and policy by bringing that different experience, that diversity to the conversation, to the policy decisions? Something that's happened that you've inputted to that's led to better outcomes for women and girls.
I think when I was chair of Sport Wales, I took over an organisation as chair that was clearly whose governance clearly wasn't fit for purpose. Like lots of sports organisations at that time, this is 15 years ago. And it became apparent to me that for all the great executive staff we had in the organisation who were doing really good work around advancing sport in general, but also sport for girls and women, the board just wasn't at the right level to be able to scrutinise and challenge that effectively. And so I set about trying to reinvent a board that included people who might be closer to the coalface, so to speak, closer to the athletics track, to put it differently. So people who'd either recently been involved in sport themselves as coaches or participants, or who'd been parents of children who'd been involved in sport, either positively or negatively, because we need to hear from different voices there. And over a period of 3 years, we were able to recruit a board that felt much more in tune with the direction we were going in terms of the strategy for sport in Wales. But that was a battle at times as well. And I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with the concept of trying to move people on maybe before they're ready to move on. And I don't want to sound brutal about that, but there is a moment where if you're trying to reconstruct a board, you need to lose some board members as well as bring in new faces, and that can be quite delicate to handle for any leader. But being sympathetic to people is not the same as being empathetic, and if your goal is to modernize and strengthen and improve the efficacy of a board, I'm afraid you do have to have hard conversations with some board members about whether their role has reached a kind of natural conclusion. And I did have to do that. But I think of myself as being an empathetic person, although I'm always nervous when people say that, because usually people who are not empathetic who claim to be empathetic. But I feel that my own values are such that I could understand the position of some board members who probably felt that they were being edged out. And I had tough conversations with them. I would rather say to somebody, we really appreciate what you've done for us in Welsh sport, and there'll always be a welcome for you in any environment, but we do need something different now. And I'd rather have those conversations than look as if I'm sort of slyly pushing people out of the door. Another example, Anna Marie, is more recent with UEFA, but lots of participants will remember the Luis Rubiales matter at the World Cup, Women's World Cup final, and his forced kiss on a Spanish player.
Yeah.
Now, it would have been very easy at that moment for me, as somebody involved in women's football, to join in the kind of chorus of disapproval on social media, because I felt as repulsed by it as anyone else. But it seemed to me that that was going to be a moment where we could actually try and shift some of the deep-seated misogynies that exist in football. So rather than shout on social media, I had quite a few delicate conversations with key people at UEFA, and I tried to show that this wasn't a one-off incident that could be buried and we could move on, whether that involved the sacking of Rubiales, as proved to be the case, and a move on. I made a lot of effort to try and talk about what that represented in terms of the balance of power in football and how women had been treated over the years. And out of that came a project that I'm still working on now, but I hope will finish soon, which was the Gender Equality Working Group of UEFA, which I've chaired. And we had a brief of looking at all of the infrastructure of football across Europe. So looking at the elected positions within federations and UEFA, the appointed positions to UEFA committees. There's about, I mean, gosh, it must be about 400 or 500, excuse me, appointed positions as committee members and match observers and delegates and so on, as well as the staffing structure of UEFA. And that's been quite a big project I've worked on with some great people within UEFA and the board. And we're getting close to issuing our recommendations now. But listen, if there is some good from that, that to me will justify an approach that was less about performative leadership. So being seen to say something, and I did get asked to say a lot at that time,
Yeah.
and more about what I regard as real leadership, which is actually sometimes just keeping your mouth shut and trying to instigate change behind the scenes.
And tell me, Laura, I mean, it's fascinating, and I think that this is diplomacy, you know, at work when you're faced with situations like that. But there must also have been times when you've had to stand up and speak truth to power in really tough moments, and actually come out and say things that might not be popular in the environment you're in. How do you decide when the right time is to speak out and do that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perennial problem, isn't it? And it's more difficult for women because we don't have the natural stage that men have. Can I just preface this with a remark, okay? Because I think it's really important to say this. There is nothing for any woman to be intimidated of in the world of sports governance, because by and large, it's populated by men who are pretty mediocre. And there are some exceptional men involved, okay, as well. But by and large, there are a whole swathe of very, very mediocre men involved in sports governance. And every woman I meet, and I do as much as I can in the form of mentoring and development support for women who are at a different stage of their career, every time I speak to women, they talk about being intimidated around raising their voices and so on. And whilst I understand that, a precursor to that is to remember you probably know more and are more articulate than most of the people already around that table. So give yourself confidence from that in the first place. Use the experience you have and the knowledge you have to contribute. But secondly, it is important to choose your moment to do it. Mainly because you usually only have one bite of the cherry with these things. And so you don't want to show your cards too early, and you don't want to miss the boat, to mix lots of metaphors. So it's about finding that sweet spot, really, where you can contribute in a meaningful way. And the tips that I would give colleagues here around that are, first of all, to do your homework before meetings and boards. You know, find out what other people are thinking, because sometimes you don't have to articulate everything. You can wait for somebody else to say it, and you only know if they're going to say it if you speak to them before the board meetings. That's really important. The second thing that's really important is to know your ground, you know, do your homework. Don't just come in with a kind of instinctive comment, because if somebody wants to oppose you, they'll have all the tools to oppose you if it's instinctive rather than evidenced. So women naturally over prepare because we know the terrain is harder for us, but don't worry about that. It's much better to over prepare than it is to under prepare, believe me, because people will be looking to undermine a comment you make. So if you've got all the tools around you and you've got the evidence around you, more power to your elbow. So I think that's the second thing. And then thirdly, be charming and polite and diplomatic. I think we can all do that. It's a good style, I think, of contributions as a leader. There's very rarely a moment where you need to shout or raise your voice, because the moment's gone if you're doing that, quite frankly. If you can be polite and respectful and allude to the counter arguments that have gone before you, but then very firm about what you want to say, I think that stands you in much greater stead. And then finally, learn to speak concisely. Again, you'll be better than most people in this space if you learn to speak concisely, because one of my big frustrations is people who over elaborate their contributions, who go on and on and on round the houses to make a very straightforward point. Sometimes 3 sentences is better than 30 sentences, honestly, in terms of focus and traction, if you like, how your comments land.
Great, that's really helpful. And actually, I was just taking a quick glance at the questions that come in, and one from Priya Colley asking about the most successful way of getting topics discussed and gaining buy-in from male board members. I think you've pretty much answered that in
well,
that one in terms of the level,
Yeah, sure. But Anne-Marie, one other thing I would add to that is that in certain political spaces, like the space I work in now in UEFA, which I think is fair to say is fairly traditional in terms of governance, it's clearly a good idea to prepare the ground for your intervention. So meetings with the president, meetings with the general secretary before the board meetings to make sure they're aware of an issue that you want to bring up. A kind of no surprises policy. That's not the same in every organization. I appreciate that. But for me, in this new world that I'm operating in, it's absolutely fundamental. And I think that works better then, because they know where you're coming from. They know you've got a reasoned argument. You're not just, bouncing off somebody else's comments, and they can handle their response as well, which I just think is good manners as much as anything else.
And the next, we've got a following up question in a way from that, from Ilham Groenwald. It just says, have you been part of a board with majority women representation, and what were some of the challenges you experienced in that case? Or maybe not, maybe never.
Well, I wish I had been. I have in politics, because my academic work is in the political space around constitutional politics in Wales, and I've chaired an expert panel that was majority female, and I've chaired a commission that was majority female. So I've had that experience, but maybe not surprisingly, I haven't been in that world in sport, because sport remains overwhelmingly male dominated, and for me, as somebody who's come from football particularly so, if you look at the Council of FIFA and the Exco of UEFA and the boards of the federations, it's still the case that they're overwhelmingly male. But it is starting to change. I mean, very, very slowly, but the journey is underway, but the destination and the timeline isn't clear, I guess, which is frustrating, I know, for all of us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you could rewrite the rules of leadership in sport to better serve women and girls, to make this sort of journey easier and to make these things easier, what would be the first thing you would change?
Well, it's a tough question, because I think the leadership failings in sport are the same as the leadership failings in any organization. It's usually a culture that's lost sight of its values. It's usually a culture that is overprotected and hasn't had sufficient scrutiny or challenge. I mean, I'll give you an example of that, and it might not be popular in some circles, but when I was a member of the board of UK Sport, I found it extremely frustrating as an organisation, because I felt there wasn't an openness or welcome to challenging or counter-critical thinking. And my instinct in everything I do is to think of alternatives to the status quo. You know, I just think that's a good kind of process to go through, even if you end up agreeing with the status quo. You know, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. But unfortunately, I found my time on UK Sport Board quite restricted and frustrating, because there didn't seem to be a culture where an alternative position was warmly welcomed and listened to and dealt with and countered. You know, I'm perfectly happy for my views to be countered, but I didn't get that sense. And if I try and rationalize that now, looking back, I think it was because the board might have been representationally diverse, but it wasn't psychologically or experientially diverse. Everyone there had come from Olympic sport, so the model of Olympic sport was kind of ingrained in everybody's thinking. It was very Anglo-centric, very little regard for Wales, Scotland, and
Yeah.
Northern Ireland in its thinking. And that's kind of as unforgivable as a male-only board, because you know, we're talking about exclusivity, and we don't assume that exclusivity is purely a sex or a gender thing. It can be racial, it can be age, it can be experience, it can be background, it can be territorial. So, you know, I've come up against that even closer to home, if you like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It in terms of leading sort of this change, if you could look back now at these things you did in UK sport and when you were in the Welsh team as captain of the Welsh team, is there anything you would love to have been able to tell yourself about having the courage to lead that sort of change? I mean, are there things you now know, having been through that not journey, but
Yeah.
through these various steps,
Yes. Yes.
that
Yeah, of
gave you
course.
the courage to do that now, that you wish, you know, perhaps when you were back then as a player you had?
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, we learn as we progress, and as I said, I'm still learning. I've learned more in the last 2 years than I learned in the previous decade, or maybe 2 decades even. I think what I would have benefited from is a sense that one needs patience to instigate change. I think I was probably too impatient about uh, trying to maneuver change within football. Natural when you're young and when you're playing that you want things to happen quickly, because obviously you want them to happen for your own benefit, but for the people around you and the generation that's just coming behind you. But there's a realization as well that, you know, you have to invest in building partnerships for change, and that does take time. Things won't happen overnight, but small wins build up to radical reforms. So you think of something as a fairly easy win or a very small win, but you know, it's part of a jigsaw that will eventually be completed, and sometimes it's just one more small gain that completes the jigsaw, if you see what I mean. So I think that's one lesson. I think the other one for me is don't worry too much about how you're perceived, other than within the space of people you really trust. I think it's hard for us as women, and particularly as young women, to accept the kind of public criticism that comes with leadership roles. And we take it very personally. I mean, look, men do as well. I'm not suggesting this is just women, but we take it overly personally. But I've learned as my career has progressed that these things pass very quickly. First of all, you know, it's tomorrow's chip papers, basically. What's said about you today will be forgotten tomorrow by and large. And life and everything moves on fairly quickly. But also, some of what's leveled at you is unjust and unfair. But rather than spend a lot of energy railing at that, it's better just to ignore it. Because if it's unfair, the chances are it's come from somebody that you don't respect anyway. And I've learned that you should have a caucus of people around you who you trust, who've got your back. Not people who will tell you what you want to think, by the way, the people who tell you what you don't want to know at that moment. But those people are the people you listen to, not other people. You blank out the rest of the white noise, because you're always going to be criticized once you're in the public arena, and the more senior you become, the more challenge will be leveled at you, but most of it will be unfair. So listen to the fair challenge and listen to the fair criticism, but edit out the rest of the noise.
It's quite important, isn't it? That bit that as you get more senior, you could potentially become more isolated. And there's been a couple of questions, and I had one anyway about allies and those people you sort of come to it naturally. That the people that are around you, who are your allies, and who are our allies as women in sport more generally. What role do you think they play in breaking down the systemic barriers, particularly men, I think, in sport? Because, you know,
Yeah,
at the IWG, we truly believe in system change, that there are not flawed women. The women don't need fixing in order to change the way sport works.
yeah,
It's the
yeah.
system that needs to be fixed to be more open. So how can we use and how can we bring along our allies, both men and women, to help us
Yes, yeah,
in that?
it's really important. And allies can be male or female, but because the balance of power at the moment, rests with men, it's really important that they are better placed to change the system and the infrastructure of discrimination and exclusion in sport. So of course we need them involved. But a little part of me doesn't like to overpraise male allies because this is what they should be doing. I mean, if they can't see that a lopsided organization is not good for sport, however that nature of that lopsided perception is, then they're not good leaders. So, I don't want to overpraise that in any way. But on the other hand, we need to build alliances for change because it's very, very rare that one person will instigate a significant change. It's much more likely that it will be a team effort. So we bring people along in that way. But I think we need men particularly to look at their behaviors in power environments. And this is very much the world I'm in now. I don't think men deliberately exclude women when they're in social spaces, but they gravitate towards each other, mainly because they know each other from having worked in that space for a long time. That's something that could change at the click of a finger. We could do a session with male leaders about how instead of always mixing with their friends and colleagues in social spaces, that they actively seek to talk to 10 women who are new to that space. Now, I do that in my UEFA work. If I see women who I haven't seen before, for example, in the events around the Euro this summer, when we had major conferences and various networking events, rather than speak to the people I know, I'll make an effort to go and speak to women that I don't know and introduce myself. And sometimes I won't even introduce myself, just have a nice, easy chat with people. And I think that's a really important principle to follow and a very easy one. And if men could do that, they would make the lives of women in those networking environments much, much easier. Because let's be frank, going in as one of almost always a minority of women into a space that is dominated by men wearing the same garb, the same height, the same look, can be quite intimidating. And for a woman to actually, how can I put it? For a woman to find a way into a group of men without looking pushy and forceful is a very, very delicate thing. And if men were to open up that group a bit more, then that would make things a damn sight easier for women. So it's a very practical thing, but something that could make a big difference.
It does. I think as you get older, you get a little bit sort of braver at these things, don't you? And I find I quite often don't mind going in and saying, can I help with your gender balance in this group? Can I just have a chat?
Well, that would be great. That
So
wouldn't go down well in football circles. That's a slight problem, Anna Marie. But I mean, I got a lot of sympathy for it. But again, it's different cultures, isn't it, about how these
yeah.
things work.
But the answer is not just to add women, though, is it, to these environments? I mean, if we just keep adding women into a system that's flawed, it's not necessarily going to help them to shine at their best and help with those decisions. So, is there a turning point? What's the key thing that we need to change? How can we transform the system, I guess, is the question.
So I think we need, just as we need the right men, we need the right women. I've seen in football the wrong women. Sorry, I don't want to sound, overly critical here, but when I say the wrong women, I mean the women who are not going to instigate change once they're elected or appointed to positions, just as men haven't, by the way. This isn't picking on the women, but we need the right women. We need women who are knowledgeable, confident, strategic, involved at board level for sure. We also need them to know the sports. I think there's a real risk with the governance model we have in sport now, where I'm entirely supportive of boards where we have independent non-exec directors, but I'm nervous of boards that have pushed so much authority to non-execs who are outside the sport, that the execs are actually having a free ride when it comes to strategic decision making. There has to be independent voices who understand the sport that they're involved in, if you get my drift. Because otherwise you're allowing chief execs or general secretaries or federation presidents, however you want to put it, too much power without a check and balance from the board. Now, that isn't just a woman thing, it's a general thing, but it's something we need to think about. We also need to make sure that women who do have a position of leadership have it in their contracts, in inverted commas, to help other women around them. There are still women, and this might, defy belief in this audience, but there are still women who are very happy being the top dog in any organization and not looking around them to see who else should be at the table, in the space, in the cheese and wine, in the match, in whatever it is. And that's unforgivable, quite frankly, because, for me personally, I've had such tremendous support in my career, both in sport and in politics for that matter, from women who realized that just because they'd had it tough to get to their position didn't mean we all had to have it tough to get to ours. And so they lubricated the way for the rest of us to come through. And I take that very, very seriously. I think that's just an obligation, and it's unforgivable if that doesn't happen. And what else? Well, I guess like everything, it's about recognizing that you don't have to be in that role for that long. I'm a big fan of term limits. I think there's only so much energy you can put into activating for change without burning yourself out completely. And I'm very conscious of that, by the way, at the moment. Not just burning yourself out, but actually burning bridges around you where you've pretty much used up all your capital and there won't be much left to instigate change. So if you're aware of that, and if you're self-aware and self-conscious, you know when the time is to stand down and pass the baton on to somebody else. But you can only pass the baton on if you've brought other women into the space that you're in. So it's a kind of circular argument, really.
It is, isn't it? There are some quite nice questions here. So before we go too much into the sort of the next section, a question from Paul Eric Stadler. What are some effective ways we can engage members of an organization in learning about gender equality and awareness and provide opportunities for further education? Have you got a
Well, look,
I mean, we could spend all day doing this, but have you got a quick answer to this one?
The work you do, the IWG, the work that the sports councils do, the work that women's organizations do, like Women in Football, in my case, and every federation will have something that is, set up to improve gender diversity. All of those organizations have some great practical tips, which, I won't rehearse now because they're out there, so to speak. For me, it's more about leadership in the first instance, because if the leader of the organization, whether that's the president or the chair of the board or the GS or the chief exec, if they're not seeing an opportunity for strengthening gender representation and improving the board, then there's something wrong with the leadership, because that should be a value really ingrained in every sporting organization, and everybody should hold it to account for that, whether it's the member clubs or the federations or the leagues, however the sport is set up. They should be holding their organization to account in terms of what they do on this agenda, because there's no shortage of support in this space, as you know, Anna Marie. So, it's lead a horse to water, basically.
Yeah, and that nicely follows up with a question from Pippa Chapman, who asks about what role does evidence play in shaping change in diverse leadership? And I know, I mean, we've obviously got an insight hub on the IWG website, but are there other areas, Laura, where you've seen good evidence, or where you've used evidence and data to try and change something?
Yeah, there is. And I think a lot of it should be cross-sectoral. I think sometimes in sport, we talk about sport in a kind of exceptionalist way, as if sport is unique. And it is in some regards, but it's not completely unique. There are parallels with other sectors like education or finance or politics or business more generally. And sometimes we don't learn and transfer evidence from those sectors into the work that we do in sport. So I think that's a really good a good recommendation. But I also think evidence will only take you so far. There's got to be a buy-in and a commitment that is based on equity, fairness, responsibility, and so on. I think you can present the best evidence in the world, but if you haven't captured somebody's heart and mind on change, you won't get something through. And I'm finding that now with the work I'm doing in UEFA, the appeal is not presenting a stack of very closely argued evidence and data. It's about having more emotional conversations, if you like, with individuals who may never have really thought about this, who may have never worked with women in their sport, in this case in football, and therefore they need an emotional pull and an emotional understanding. And so come armed with evidence by all means, but don't be frightened to use emotions as well, because that's what we're all about ultimately. We wouldn't be involved in sport unless we cared passionately for it, and it had given us a real kind of emotional return from our involvement.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Laura, I wanted to ask you a question about sort of role modeling and the example you set for younger women. But I mean, what you've alluded to in terms of your behaviors in the boardroom is also the role model and the behavior, the example you set for the men around the room and for those who are already in a board. And I think we forget sometimes that one or two women in a room can change the direction of a conversation completely. So there is a really important role that we play for younger women coming up, but actually as to younger men who are in the room and to some older men in the room.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that all of us who conduct ourselves in the right way, and by the right way, I mean based on values and respect and so on, are behaving in a way that makes sports governance attractive to other people. Because there's plenty of examples of bad practice in sports leadership and sports governance, so that have put people off over the years. So we're remedying that now, I hope, by showing that there are good ethics in how one behaves as a leader. And I do think that appeals to men as well as women. I think the old model of sports governance must be hugely off-putting to anybody, whether they're male or female. So I think we can do more in that space. But I think ultimately all of this is about how you behave as a person. It's not particularly about your behavior in the boardroom, because clearly there's a professional space and a personal space, and we don't behave identically in them, because otherwise we'd sit around in our pajamas, with our feet up on a stool, and it's not, we have to adopt some differential characteristics in any space, clearly, but you have to bring yourself to that space, and there are certain things that I'm very clear about that are red lines for me. If I heard a sexist or a racist or homophobic comment, then I would call it out. I might not always do it in an instinctive way at that moment, but I will make sure that is called out, which is a different thing to calling it out yourself. But you have to deal with things like that, because those are red lines really in how we operate in sport. Or if I saw somebody bullying another person in sport or belittling another person, then I'd make sure that that was dealt with. So I think it's all of those kind of behaviors that are based on us as people that are significant. And the people who are less effective leaders, in my experience, are the ones who've adopted a kind of leadership robe, if you like, that has very little to do with who they are as a person, and far more to do with what they think a leader looks like and behaves like. And that tends to be quite authoritarian and quite power concentrated and so on. So, I think there's a space now for all of us to be bring our different leadership profiles into this space and actually be successful with them.
Yeah, No, absolutely. A couple of questions in the Q&A, Laura, that tie together here. So Rita Mugimba has asked, as a first female vice president, have you experienced the spotlight effect in this role? Have you, has there been something there? And then I guess slightly, I'm slightly interpreting now, but Antivas and hi, lovely to see you online. How can we better support and protect women on boards from harassment, bullying, and abuse together? So I guess, I mean, the
Yeah.
spotlight can sometimes be very positive, but equally it can also be quite a negative thing. And then how do we put in place things to support
Yeah.
and protect?
Well, look, being the first of anything is quite intimidating, as well as a cause for celebration. But I'm quite a kind of balanced person in that I never get too carried away with anything, because I'm very conscious that everything comes with good baggage and bad baggage. So being in the spotlight as the only female VP means that people are watching more carefully what I say and do. And I've had lots of examples of that recently with policy decisions that UEFA, for example, are considering. We're also helped and hindered, if you get my drift, by the fact that we've got probably the most active scrutinizing sports media anywhere in the world. So our media wants to know what we're about to vote on in a big congress or a big exco meeting. Lots of countries don't have that, of course, and that's an advantage and a disadvantage simultaneously, of course. But for me, I find it good because it keeps me on my toes. It makes me think about what I'm going to contribute in sessions and so on. I'm not I'm not a big fan of being in the spotlight because I'm instinctively an introvert by personality, but my professional career has been largely doing things that attract the spotlight. So I can't do much about that. But I take it seriously, not particularly for me personally, but because I know that other women are watching and wanting us to succeed. Just as I did when I saw talented women in the past, I wanted them to succeed because it opened the door for me to also become involved then. So I think you've got to embrace that part of the spotlight, but also accept that with it will come a lot of negativity. I mean, obviously, the world that we're in now with social media, and thank goodness that kind of Twitter or X has decreased in significance. Well, depending on which way you look at it over recent times, because there is no doubt whatsoever that that would be a pretty unpleasant place when it comes to dealing with, senior women in sport these days. But part of me just thinks, we have to develop our own resilience as well to cope with this, because the environment is not going to change as fast as we'd like it to. And there are only two options in leadership. One is to get involved and try and improve and change things. The other is to sit at home and complain. There's not much space in between those two things, honestly. And so if we're going to get involved and put our hands up and contribute, we've got to accept that it won't always be plain sailing. And at times it'll be blinking uncomfortable and unpleasant and horrible and everything else. But it's back to my point about the group around you. If you have a really good group of supportive colleagues and people you trust who've got your back, then you'll manage and you'll pave the way for it to be easier for somebody who's coming behind you then.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It feels like it is the right time to stop. We celebrate the trailblazers all the time, and I opened this session by calling you a trailblazer, but actually we've really got to move from those individuals into
Yeah.
collective leadership, haven't we?
Yeah.
In terms of where we are now, I mean, I don't know whether you see it or see it yet, but do you have hope that the leadership shift is towards equality is real and irreversible? Are we getting to a point where we can begin to relax, or should we be changing the approach that we take?
We should never relax, because I think that would leave us vulnerable to a kind of backlash to where we've got to by now. So I don't think we should ever relax. But I think we're coming to a position where all of this work doesn't have to be done by women alone. That's good, because I think men understand that there is a benefit for them to have improved and more diverse sports governance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we the the zeitgeist within sport, particularly within Europe, I think, is for change and improvement. I can't speak authoritatively for other parts of the world. I can to a degree for football, but not for other sports. But I'm sure participants on this call will say, in my country, things are still, at a very rudimentary stage. And I don't doubt that, by the way, because I know that's the case in football. But I think we need to take that very seriously, because I wouldn't like to see a situation where Europe, and particularly Western Europe, regards itself as having solved this issue and therefore takes its foot off the pedal for the rest of the world. We're only as strong as our weakest link in sport. And if women's voices are being excluded in a part of one continent of the world, then it's all of our responsibility to try and help and deal with that and let people learn from our mistakes over the years. So that's a kind of glass half empty, glass half full answer. And I think I'm pretty clear that we've crossed an important Rubicon when we talk about gender equality now. But I've seen in other fields that can unravel very quickly again. And unless it's territorially spread across the world, there's a danger that, a large part of the territorial community will move backwards. And that would affect all of us and certainly wouldn't help in terms of gender equality anywhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess that's from an IWG perspective. That's why we're a global network, so that we can share those learnings and be able to sort of knit networks together to try and keep that change going. I wanted to ask, I've got a couple of other small questions, but there's so many good questions in the chat, Laura, and I'm conscious that we've got 9 minutes left. So let me just see if we can quick fire a couple of these and see what your answers can be. Let me just start here with, here we are, Yakameen Ravensbergen. Afternoon, Yakameen. How bad is the influence of misogynistic views and their support from a lot of, in brackets, old white male leaders, such as the Tate brothers? And can that change what we've already achieved in female leadership in sports?
Well, it's a risk, obviously. And I've described the kind of experiences that I've had, not just in the last 2 years, but for longer, as kind of a whole pattern of micro misogynies, and that describes it better for me, because they're kind of small misogynies that show somebody isn't treating you equally as a woman, but they're very hard to put your finger on exactly or to complain about actively, but they're still there. And they're handled differently the more senior you are. So I think it's important to talk about those things. But the more we talk about these things, the better awareness there is amongst other people of why these hold back sport. So it's back to the point about allies and about leadership and about culture. We only develop a stronger culture for governing sport if we address some of the wider societal problems we have and stop seeing sport as an exception to rules. My starting point with the debate on UEFA is that we can't be an organisation that only has 2 women on its board out of 21. We can't be. And the argument that that's the way it's always been, or that football is changing more slowly, is not acceptable. So let's kind of know what our parameters are to push back on.
So let me follow that up then with a question from Karis Alps, which says, what do you think about gender quotas in governing bodies in general? Is that time over, not there yet, or rather not needed, or something else?
Well, I wouldn't say, because people will misunderstand it, that I'm a fan of quotas, but I am actually, because this is based on reality. If you want to argue that quotas are unnecessary, you need to compile evidence, which I don't think is there, that this process will happen naturally and organically. I don't agree that's the case, not in organisations which are still locked in an idea that men govern sport. So I think quotas are necessary. I wouldn't even say they're a necessary evil, because if I look at the quotas we've had in football, they've generated far stronger people, in this case women, than the men who were already there. So there's a really important principle to consider when you talk about quotas, and I appreciate we haven't got much time, which is, if you think the organisation is a meritocracy and operates on the basis of a meritocracy, great. women, men, people of color will come through naturally. If you look at that organization and it's one-dimensional, the chances are it's not a meritocracy, and therefore you need quotas, because you will wait forever for organic generational change and you lose out on a whole generation of really talented women in the meantime. So hence quotas are important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen behaviors just change just by having a number of women in the
Yeah.
room, and conversations changing that really can transform organizations. I'm going to give you one last question, but there's a lot of questions still in some really good ones in the Q&A. Thank you to everybody who's been inputting them. We will try and respond to each one of you in writing back to those questions, which we can do later. But I just want to ask you, if there's one practical step each of us can take to hold the door open for somebody else tomorrow, what would it be?
I think for me, it's demonstrating your openness and willingness to help other women. So in every space that we're in, whatever it is, whether it's a conference or a workshop, and I know you've got the major conference in 26 in Birmingham. Hopefully I'll be there. You know, I don't have any kind of hierarchical approach to who I speak to or conversations. In fact, I'd like to speak to as many people as possible. So I think those of us who are in a position of power should open our arms, if you like, to the whole generation of women who are in that space and have conversations with them and encourage them, because sometimes it just takes a word of encouragement. It did for me, a word of encouragement for me to go for another role. And I think we have to take that role model responsibility quite seriously. So in every space, we should speak to as many women as we can and listen to them and encourage them to take that next step in sport.
Brilliant, Laura, thank you. I am sure that
Pleasure.
all of the work that you've done is going to be an incredible legacy, if I'm allowed to use that word, of your leadership, and will begin to really transform the UEFA and all the organisations, and also help to inspire everyone listening today. I just want to say thank you to you. It's been amazing to have somebody with your breadth of experience across so many sectors, all of which have kind of come together. Thank you to everybody. I've been trying to keep an eye on the webinar chat. It's quite difficult when you're listening to Laura as well at the same time. I think we've got at least 4 continents, if not 5 continents, here represented. So truly global conversation. And we will be carrying on this conversation. Thank you to you all. We'll be carrying on this conversation in the next shift session, when we focus on visibility and power, but also at the conference next year. As Laura has mentioned, we are a network of networks, and the Global Summit in 2026 in Birmingham, this leadership is still one of the main key themes of our 5 themes that we'll be talking about. So Laura, thank you for your candid comments, for your insights and your honesty. I would ask all of you who have been listening today to reflect on your sphere of influence, how you can help lead this shift, encourage others, and we're going to have a great time looking at this. We still have 2 minutes left, so let me leave you with one last question, Laura, from Chloe Burdett. What advice would you give your younger self?
Okay, don't rush. Take your time a bit more. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And just be confident. You know, I've seen so much talent in the women I work with now in football and in sport more generally, and sometimes they don't realize how good they are, you know. So, you know, if somebody tells you you're good, honestly, you are good. And finally, I was just going to say, Anna Marie, you know, I happy to put my money where my mouth is. You know, at any event that I'm at, I'd really love people to come and introduce themselves and tell me what they're doing in sport. And I'd love to have a chat with you all as well, you know, whether that's at the conference next year or before. You know, I feel that's a really important obligation for me, and like it is for you, Anna Marie, and I take that seriously. So, you know, I'd be delighted to chat to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think if once you've made it to a leadership role, that you feel you want to be able to share that and almost have a duty to try and, my predecessor at British Rowing, Di Ellis, always used to say, you drag somebody else up with you. So for every woman that makes up, if we all dragged 2 more up with us, we'd soon be multiplying the numbers. Thank you again, Laura. It's been amazing. Thank you to all of you. We have a feedback survey which we'll be sending out to everybody that's here tomorrow. So please do give us some feedback. Our next shift session is on Wednesday, the 26th of November. It'll be on visibility. Visibility is power. So, you know, the more feedback you give us, the better we can improve that shift session for you for the next time. The Global Summit program is now live on the event site, which is iwgglobalsummit2026.org. So please do check that out, register to be the first to know about tickets, ticket sales and prices, and the program and the themes and speakers. On that, thank you very much to everybody, and we'll be in touch with those of you who we haven't managed to answer your questions yet. Bye.